It was Jerome's first day at his new school. He had moved over during the summer break and was looking forward to a fantastic school year. His parents had suffered a nasty divorce, and he had moved to New Orleans with his mother, who had sole custody. He had a lot of expectations for the new year. He was going to make many friends and stop being a nerd. "Are you going to be okay?" his mother asked as they pulled into the school driveway. For the 100th time, he nodded. McKinney High was more significant than his old school, but it was just a school, right? She kissed him goodbye, and he hurried out of the car without a wave. He rushed towards the trooping students headed into McKinney High. At 15, Jerome was tall and skinny with ginger hair. He was still undergoing puberty and had acne scattered all over his face. He had a tub of sunscreen in his bag and, under his mother's supervision, had put a decent amount on his face before they left the house. He stared around the hallway eagerly and in excitement. He had Googled a lot about his new school, which had twice the size of his old school student body. "Watch where you're going, punk," a chubby girl said, pushing him aside. "Sorry," Jerome quickly apologized as he held on to his school bag. He looked around for a smiling face, but it was the first day of school, and everyone was on and about. And then he spotted a smiling face, a tall guy just like him with ginger hair. How cool was that? Just as Jerome headed for him, something crazy happened. Two big dudes began to punch him. Everyone else ignored what was happening, making their way around the commotion. Jerome hurried over to him. "Hey, stop it!" He waved his lean hands. The two dudes let go of the guy. "Who the hell are you?" the bigger boys said. "You are hurting him," Jerome said, pointing at the boy with blood coming from his nose. "What is going on here?" a slender woman with a stern look asked. "We wonder the same thing, Miss Agatha. We found Jacob beating up this guy," the other guy said, pointing at Jerome. "Who, me?" Jerome said, stunned. "Is that right, Jacob?" Miss Agatha asked Jacob, who sat on the floor. The two bullies looked at Jacob. Jerome's eyes widened when Jacob nodded. "What? He didn't even know any of them. This was his first day in school." "That's not true. They were the ones beating him up," Jerome defended. A few minutes later, he found himself at the principal's office. The principal, Mr. Scott, was a busy man, as he told Jerome. He didn't like to waste his time on frivolous matters. He stared at Jerome disapprovingly. "I didn't do anything, I swear," Jerome defended himself. It was ridiculous that he would bully a kid on the first day. Who would even believe that? "Then who did it?" the principal asked, hands on his waist. "I told you who did it. The two boys did it. I am new here." "Why did you transfer schools? I am thinking about a bad record with violence, huh?" the principal asked with an intense stare. "Why I transferred here is none of your business," Jerome blurted out. He did not want pity from anyone when he told them they had moved here after his parents divorced. "Then I'm going to have to call your mother," the principal said. 20 minutes later, his mother showed up. She was not pleased to learn that her son had gotten into a fight on his first day of school. It was not even break time yet. "Ours is a school of discipline and integrity. If he's to stay here, he has to adhere to the rules of our beloved school," the principal said with a bored expression. "I assure you, Mr. Scott, he's going to behave. Right, Jerome?" his mother said with a stern look. "Right," Jerome said. He was late for his class, and it was just his luck that the door made a loud creak as he got in. All eyes were on him as he looked for an empty seat. He found one closest to him, but when he got there, someone had put a bag on it. He moved to another, and a bag was put on it, and so on. He found himself at the back of the class, which made him strain his eyes to see the board, despite his glasses on. Class ended, and Jerome stood up. At least he tried to, but the chair was glued to his trousers. He struggled to get up, but the class laughed at him. Tears welled in his eyes. It was his first day at school, and it was a tough one. From him being falsely accused to him being now glued to his chair. It wasn't even broken time yet. The week was slow for Jerome, filled with one problem. It seemed like everything was not going on in his favor. Pranks were being played on him in class, and the teachers ignored what was happening. Jackson and Peter, the bullies he had met on his first day, were the masterminds, and nobody did anything to confront them. While Jackson was the mayor's son, Peter's father was a judge, and they were deemed untouchable by the principal and teachers, who chose to turn a blind eye to their harassment of other students. "Don't worry, some new kid is going to come along, and they will ignore you," Jacob said. He had come to apologize to him after his first day. He knew if he hadn't lied, Jackson and Peter would bully him even more. Jerome had been bullied for most of the school year at his previous school. The divorce had worsened as his father had begun to date his principal. Moving here was supposed to be a new beginning, but the bullying had followed him. "Hey, Thread," Jackson said, pushing him against a locker. Jerome looked around. Every time Jackson bullied someone, it was like all the teachers and other students had disappeared. "What's in your bag today?" Jackson said, grabbing Jerome's bag. Peter emptied the bag and took Jerome's lunch and the money his mom had given him. "That's mine," Jerome said quietly. "What did you say?" Jackson asked as he pinched Jerome's cheek. The bullying continued for months, and Jerome reclined into a shell. He barely talked to anyone in school. He didn't speak to his mother at home. He was always afraid because of what Jackson and Peter did to him at school. There was no one to talk to because they would either not believe him or do anything about it. Jerome tried to keep it under the radar. He hid in the restroom during lunchtime. He hid until classes began before he got into class and hid behind in the class until everyone went home. The duo caught up with his escape plans and found a way to get through and bully him. One morning, a rumor went around the school that test questions had been stolen from the biology teacher's office. Mr. Donald had arrived at school early and found the test questions missing before the person could return them. The school board was investigating the theft. "Whoever committed this act will be expelled. I assure you, we will find you," the principal announced in assembly. The students filed back into the class as instructed. They were to remain in a class while an investigation took place. Jerome hurried to the bathroom stall to ease himself. It was when he was there that he'd heard two familiar voices. "They are going to find out we stole the test," Peter said with a shaky voice. "Shut up, stupid. They are not going to find out," Jackson said. But Peter was scared. "The janitor saw us in the hallway." Jackson scoffed. "He won't say a word. He knows my father will deal with him. Don't worry, I have it all sorted out. No one will believe we stole the results." Of course, they were the ones who stole the result, Jerome thought. He waited in the stall, contemplating if he should tell the principal what he knew, but decided not to. He could get into trouble if he told Mr. Scott. Besides, he didn't want Jackson and Peter to get into trouble. Yes, they bullied him, but he chose to see the good in them. His grandfather used to say, "Bullies are all tough and mighty, even on the outside, but on the inside, they are just scared little kids who yearn for love." Even though they had been awful to him, he wasn't going to reveal their secret to anyone. During the second period, the principal and head of security came into the class. "Jerome, come with us," the principal said. "I don't know anything about the stolen tests," Jerome said. The principal and head of security said nothing as they led Jerome to his locker. Jerome gasped as they opened it. Inside was the stolen test results. "I knew you were trouble from the first day I set my eyes on you." "No, I didn't steal it," Jerome said in surprise. His defense fell on deaf ears. Even when he tried to tell the principal what he had heard, he refused to believe him. His mother picked him up. The ride back home was tranquil. She was disappointed in him. He was also disappointed in her for not believing him. He had never stolen. She knew him better than that. "You are grounded for 3 months," his mother said when they got home. He had been suspended while the school board held a disciplinary panel to decide on the appropriate punishment, but Jerome knew the result. He would be expelled. The principal had made it clear he had no future at McKinney High. The following day after his mother went to work, Jerome schemed. He was not going to be the fall guy for Jackson and Peter. They had not only bullied him, but they had also embarrassed him in front of his classmates. It was supposed to be a fun school year, but they had made it into a horrible year, with him about to be expelled. No one believed him, or instead they chose not to. It was up to him to prove his innocence. On Saturdays, Peter worked at an ice cream parlor owned by his uncle. Jerome stood by the counter, but had no intentions of ordering. "I know what you did," Jerome said. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said. "I know you and Jackson stole the biology test," Jerome said. "That's not true. You don't know what you're saying," Peter defended. Says who? I have proof of it on my phone. I was in the restroom, and I heard the two of you talking. Jerome smiled as Peter's face went pale. It wasn't my idea. It was Jackson. His father will send him to boarding school if he doesn't pass his exam. He was the one who stole the teacher's keys during lunchtime. I swear it wasn't me. Jerome had lied. He didn't have any proof on his phone, but with Peter giving Jackson away, Jerome recorded his confession on his phone. The following morning, while the disciplinary committee went on, Jerome appeared. You are not supposed to be here, the principal snapped when he saw Jerome. I'm here to exonerate myself, Jerome said before playing the recording. Peter was summoned before the committee, and with the evidence before him, he gave out his accomplice, Jackson, who had no other option but to confess. The following day, Jerome strolled into school with his shoulder held high and a confident smile. His classmates clapped on his back and hailed him for his actions. Jackson and Peter had been suspended, and the school board would no longer tolerate their bullying and bad behavior. Jerome knew he would have a fantastic school year from now on. Zoe got the divorce papers on Monday morning. She was in the middle of doing the laundry when the bell rang and she was served the divorce papers. She sat in the pristine kitchen, staring at the documents, confused. If the papers weren't directly addressed to her, she would have believed it was a case of mistaken identity. Or perhaps this was a prank and a TV production crew would jump out from the hedges. However, this was her reality. A confusing reality. Bruce, her husband of 15 years, was divorcing her. Just this morning, she had set out his clothes for work, made breakfast for him, and carried his bag to the car, waving him goodbye before returning to the house to start the house chores. Her friend Nancy hurried over, and she burst into tears, shoving the papers at her. This has got to be a joke, right? Otherwise, why on earth would her husband divorce her? It just didn't make sense. Have there been any problems? Have you guys been fighting? Nancy asked. They had never raised their voices against each other in all the years they were married. Sure, their marriage was not the same as it had been when they married. There was some distance between them, and they were not as intimate as they used to be. Still, a divorce? Just last week, she suggested they go on a vacation, and he gave her the go-ahead to find exotic places. Have you spoken to him? Nancy asked. His secretary says he's busy every time I call, Zoe said. All day, Zoe was not herself. She was in a blank state, staring at the walls, over and over. She tried to think about what had gone wrong in their marriage. She was a good and obedient wife. She stayed home, tendering to the house, while Bruce provided for the family. Bruce came home late. She was asleep, but she hurried out of bed. What's going on, Bruce? She asked, waving the papers. She stared at him, hoping he would apologize and tell her it was a mistake. It is what it is. I want a divorce, he said, reaching for a bottle of scotch. She shook her head in disbelief. No. You can't do this, Bruce. Please. What have I done wrong? Please tell me. I will change. I will. You have done nothing wrong. It's just, I'm tired, Zoe. I need more from a wife, Bruce said. She stared at him, confused. What did he mean? I need a wife who's not as boring as you are. A wife who goes out there to work. A good-looking wife. A wife I can show to the world. She staggered at his words. You told me to quit my job. 10 years ago, she quit her job as a lawyer to be his wife. It had been a great sacrifice, but Bruce convinced her that being a traditional wife was suitable for their marriage. Well, I changed my mind, Bruce said. I will get a job. I know I've been out of work, but I don't want to be married to you anymore. I'm sorry, Zoe, but that is it. You have to admit it. This marriage is headed for the storms. We are no longer compatible. Zoe screamed, a scream filled with the pain that overwhelmed her, and then she broke down right on the floor, her heart ripped into two. The next few weeks were tough for Zoe. Bruce moved out of the house, advising her to get a lawyer. Every attempt by her to reach out to him for recognition was abortive. Their mutual friends she called to intervene had nothing to say but extended their pity to her. You need to get a lawyer fast, as she read through the latest summons delivered by Bruce's lawyers, Nancy said. She had gone through them and couldn't believe it. Since they had no children, he was leaving her with nothing. He was even taking the house from her. How was she supposed to survive? I understand that you still love him and want to settle this amicably, but Zoe, he's doing you dirty. After 15 years of being with him, he's offering you nothing? You deserve more than this, Nancy said. Zoe stared away, absently. She didn't even know what day it was. She barely ate and moped around the house, trying to come to terms with her reality. It still felt like a cruel joke, and a part of her hoped that Bruce would return home with an apology. Zoe, I'm worried about you, Nancy said with concern. Zoe didn't get a lawyer. She missed out on the meetings with Bruce and his lawyers. The blinds were drawn closed as she sat indoors in the house, wrapped in the overbearing pain that enveloped her. 15 good years she had dedicated herself to her marriage with Bruce. Court summons came in the following week. She would be held in contempt of the court if she didn't appear at the next hearing date. She would not only lose her marriage, she could also go to jail. Mr. Bruce is not here, the secretary said when Zoe showed up the following day at his office. Where did he go? Zoe asked. Bruce was a hard worker and spent most of his time at the office when he was not home. He worked at a renowned real estate firm in the city, and his clientele comprised politicians, prosperous businessmen, and women. I cannot disclose that to you, the secretary said. But I am his wife, Zoe defended. The woman had always been polite, but treated her coldly with what was happening. Have a lovely day, ma'am, the secretary said. Ma'am, you cannot go in there. Ma'am? Zoe hurried past the reception. She refused to believe the woman. Having spotted Bruce's car at the front, she was headed straight to his office when she heard voices of excitement in the conference room. There was a little gathering, with Bruce the center of attraction. Everyone had filled wine glasses in their hands. Bruce? She called out in a tiny voice. Bruce was surprised to see her there, and so were his colleagues, who had, over the years, become her friends. She had invited them to her home for dinner in the past years. Zoe, what are you doing here? Bruce asked as he pulled away from a blonde woman. Charity was her name, as she had been a guest at their home. Her eyes rested on Charity's pregnancy bump. What's going on here? Zoe asked. You are not supposed to be here, Bruce said. What's going on here? Her voice raised. We were going to tell you eventually, Charity said, placing her hand over her bump. Bruce and I are having a baby. For the next few seconds, she heard nothing, not the honks of the car below in the streets, not the clacking of keyboards coming from the next room. Not even her heart was beating. A tear slid down her eyes as she stared at the man she loved with all of her heart. You said you didn't want children. You... After a year of marriage, she had suggested they start trying to have kids, and Bruce had sat her down and told her he didn't want children. He told her children were very dedicated and would rather they enjoy their lives without the extra baggage. It was a tough pill to swallow. She had always wanted to be a mother. While dating, she would tell him she wanted 3 children, and he would smile. He had told her she could leave if she wished to be different, but how could she have left him? They had a scare a year later, and he held her hand while the doctors tied her fallopian tubes. How could he be so cruel? I'm sorry, Zoe, but it just happened. She wants to keep the child. And you? What do you want? Zoe asked as tears streamed down her face. I want to be a father, Bruce said. Zoe yelled, flinging herself at him in rage. How could he have done this to her? She was pulled back by one of his colleagues, whom she lashed at. They had all known what was happening, but had kept it a secret. How long has this been going on? How long? She yelled. You need to calm down, Miriam, his colleague, said. She glared at the woman, glared at all of them. How stupid she had been to expect loyalty for them. She had catered for Miriam's birthday just last year. She had been with Hakeem in the hospital a few months ago when he had kidney surgery. She had been there for everyone, but in her moment of tribulation, they took sides with her husband, abandoning her. Don't freaking tell me to calm down! How long has this been going on? She yelled. About 2 years, Bruce said. We were having issues, and she walked away from him and every one of them. For 2 years, he had been unfaithful. He had kept all of this a secret for 2 years, and he had been aided by those she considered family. Zoe had no idea how she got home. Immediately after getting home, she settled on a couch and searched through the contacts on her phone. It had been years since she last spoke to Dan, but what she knew to this day was that he was a good divorce lawyer, and with her whole life falling apart, she needed him. It was a tense meeting a couple of weeks later when Zoe met with Bruce and his lawyers. She had almost not made the meeting. She had stared at herself in the mirror, staring at herself in fear. She had been unwilling to let go of Bruce for a while, but now was the time. He had moved on, and so would she. It's going to be okay, Dan, her lawyer, assured her. They had been in constant communication since she reached out to him. He was excited to reunite with her and had been very pissed to listen to her tell him about what was happening. He promised to take Bruce to the cleaners, ensuring he paid for what he did. Bruce glared at her as they walked into the room. Dan had been going back and forth with Bruce's lawyer, giving her updates on what was happening. At first, she was afraid of what Dan was asking for, the house and half of his net worth. It seemed ridiculous, but Dan assured her that things would be in their favor. If we don't reach an agreement, we will be going to trial, Dan said. She was worried about this, but Dan also assured her. I didn't think you were a gold digger, Bruce spat out. Dan flared up. Zoe held him back, sensing his anger. She stared at her husband. How much she had loved him, wasting 15 years of her life. I forgive you, Zoe said. It was easy saying those words. Months ago, she hated him passionately, but she had grown in these past months. She had started working out at the gym, reunited with her old friends, and even started working on the plan for a catering and event planning business. So, are you ready to give me what I want? Zoe asked. Dan scribbled his signature on the document, and Zoe smiled. She had a long way to go, but she would not give up on loving herself.
You will come to work today, or I will have you fired, the manager screamed at Lissy over the phone. Sam, I have a fever, Lissy coughed. I can't even stand up properly. How am I going to come and work with a fever? She coughed again. Please understand, Sam. I have only taken a few days off since joining a year ago. The restaurant manager interrupted her. Hey, I don't care how many leaves you took. We are fully booked tonight, and you will be here. That's it, he told her condescendingly. Lissy was getting angrier and angrier at the arrogant man. Why don't you ask Greg to come? He is coming anyway. He is the head chef. I won't be needed if at least one chef is there. I know because I have done so many shifts alone by myself as the only chef, she told him in between coughs. He cannot come. He is not available today, the manager replied in short. He did not tell any of us that he will not be able to make it today. Did he tell you yesterday? Lissy asked him, getting angrier by the minute, still coughing. The manager stammered. He told me today, and he had a fair reason for not coming. Well, that's too bad. You will have to find a new chef for the day then. The manager lost it completely. You fricking bitch. You will come to work today, or I'll have you fired, stupido. Then he hung up. Lissy had worked for Macy's restaurant for a year as a chef. It was her first job as a chef. The Macy's was not her first choice of a place to work, but she had to start somewhere. At the time, Macy's was just a mediocre restaurant. Most of the time, she was the one who stepped up when the head chef, Greg, was absent, which has happened a lot since she joined as a chef. Greg figured out that Lissy was a competent chef and decided to take advantage of her. He would take credit for her work while taking more time away from work. He could do this perfectly since the restaurant manager and he were best buddies. This was one of those days Greg failed to show up to work, but unfortunately, Lissy was not well that day. She called the manager and told him she would not be able to come since she had a fever. The manager said she had to go since Greg would not be there. She asked if he could tell Greg to go since there was no way she could come to work with a fever and cough. The manager cursed at her and said it was fully booked for the evening and she would be fired if she did not come to work. Lissy was taken aback by the degrading way he spoke at her. It was disrespectful. Before she said another word, he hung up. Lissy was angry at him for the way he talked. She was also very hurt because it was primarily because of her hard work that they were fully booked. When Lissy first joined, it was just an average place with only a few older adults booking for dinner. After she came, she introduced several new plates that became very popular quickly. Greg envied her success, but since he was the head chef, he took most of the credit for the restaurant's turnaround. Greg and his buddy, the restaurant manager, ensured that the upper management did not find anything special about her skills. But all the restaurant staff knew it was entirely because of Lissy's skills as a chef that the restaurant finally started to thrive. Younger people who joined the team recently took her as an example of how to work in a restaurant. Lissy turned off her phone, deeply hurt by the manager's words. She turned her phone off and decided to take a good rest regardless of what happened to her job. She was barely able to go down to get a taxi. She somehow made it to her doctor, and upon examining her, the doctor gave her some medicine and advised her to stay at home for at least a couple of days until she fully recovered. After buying the prescribed drugs from the pharmacy, she took a taxi to her apartment and crawled back to bed. She was coughing, which made it very hard for her to fall asleep. The next day, she was a little better. The manager called her again but did not answer him, and instead sent him a message telling him she wouldn't be coming that day either. The manager called several times but did not answer because she did not want to put up with his childish tantrums. She was hurt by how he had talked to her the previous day. It took 2 days for her to get well enough to return to work. During her time at home, she thought of even quitting the job. But since she did nothing wrong, she decided to see what would happen if she returned to work. When she reported to work, she was stopped at the door by the manager. He told her that she was under review due to her absence. She was stunned to hear it. Although he said it, she did not think he would go that far. She knew the manager did not like her because she was talented and a woman. She was angry at how unjustly he was treating her. She told him the same. The manager then screamed at her loudly, degrading her in front of all the staff. Lissy felt helpless, and tears started to roll down her eyes. The manager enjoyed seeing her cry. He berated her even more. She could see Greg also enjoying her pain at the kitchen door. The manager and the head chef were best buddies. So maybe they were planning to send her home for good. She went back to the changing room. A couple of servers said that Greg and the manager were total jackasses and not to take what he said seriously. They liked Lissy, but they were unable to do anything. Then, after the waitress left, Elsa, a waitress who joined at the same restaurant time as Lissy did, came to Lissy. She asked Lissy not to worry and that everything would be fine. Lissy was surprised that usually silent Elsa talked to her and seemed very sure of what she said. She felt good a little because Elsa was a good person, although she did not speak with people much. If she believed it enough to tell it, Lissy, that might be true. After about 10 minutes, she was called to the review, and Greg was there also. Lissy's good hopes were short-lived as they started to accuse her of sabotaging the restaurant by being absent on a critical day. They said everything was better before Lissy joined the restaurant, which was unbelievable since Macy's was on a downward slope then. They did not listen to anything Lissy said. They did not let her even complete her sentences. They criticized her for half an hour before finally telling her she was allowed to go. She started to go back home sobbing. The rest of the staff watched helplessly. As she was trying to leave, another person came in. Everyone was surprised to see that it was the owner of the restaurant. The owner had not come to the restaurant more than a couple of times in the past 6 months. He was busy setting up a new branch of Macy's in another state. The owner saw Lissy leaving with a tear-soaked face. He asked Lissy to stop. Then he started to talk. He said that he had been looking at the past few days' events. There were a lot of customer complaints over those past few days. Sam, the manager, started blaming Lissy, telling them that she took leave without notifying her, and more lies. The owner took out his phone and showed them a photo of the manager and Greg having a beer at the beach. The manager's and Greg's faces were completely white. The owner told them how the manager and Greg took advantage of the complex working nature of Lissy and the junior manager, giving them full responsibility while they took a lot of paid time off. The owner had been looking to the issues in the restaurant even before Lissy came, but got to know that it was Lissy's talents that brought back the customers. Then the owner apologized to Lissy for all the abuse she had to go through. He said he knew that Macy was getting successful because of her skills as a great cook. He also mentioned that apart from the manager and the head chef, the rest of the staff was doing an excellent job. When he said this, Sam's and Greg's face darkened. They started to talk and tried to argue with the owner. Without saying a single word, the owner raised his hand and motioned them to stop. After several feeble attempts to make him hear them, they stopped, defeated, without even a word. Then, in front of everyone, the restaurant owner fired the manager and Greg. At the same time, he promoted Lissy to the head chef and the young junior manager to the manager post. All the staff cheered for both of them since they knew they were more than capable of the job. The fired manager and Greg got up and left, their heads lowered. Lissy was delighted and incredibly proud that her hard work had finally paid off. She thanked the restaurant owner for supporting them and promised they would make Macy's the best restaurant in the state. The owner said that he believed it and that they had his full support. The staff congratulated the newly promoted duo with sincere joy. That day, the restaurant's customers felt the change in the restaurant. Everyone was doing their job happily. Lissy cooked the best food she put out with the support team. Within a couple of months, Macy started to draw so many customers that they had to maintain a long waiting list for customers who booked weeks ahead for their dinner. Soon, Lissy hired another talented chef to support her. Between them, they devised unique dishes daily that got top customer compliments. As promised, Lissy and the new manager made the restaurant one of the best in the area. They even had to expand to the next block because they did not have enough room to cater to all the customers. The owner had made the right decision by allowing the two young people. Lissy did not stop at Macy's. She later started her restaurant in another city by her name. Lissy soon began to thrive under her well-experienced guidance. As a postscript, there's something to add. One day, while interviewing chefs at her restaurant, guess who came to interview? It was none other than Lissy's old mate, Greg. He walked into the room, and when he recognized her, his face went white like he had seen a ghost. He said nothing to her, simply stood up and left. Lissy was as surprised to see him as he did after seeing her. Later, Lissy joked that she might have given him a chance if he had owned up to his mistakes and just talked to her. She had never forgotten, but she was always willing to forgive. Jacob's sister fell suddenly. She was unconscious. Jacob screamed for his parents. "Mom, Dad, it's Alana. Something is wrong with her. Come quickly." Father came running and Mother followed. "Alana, honey, talk to me." Father tried to wake her up. He scooped her up and ran to the front porch. Mother hurried and brought some water. They asked Jacob what had happened. Jacob said that she just fell suddenly while they were playing. She was not responsive even after spraying some water on her face. The two parents were helpless. They did not want to waste any time. "Let's take her to the hospital, honey," Jacob's mother told her husband. tears running down her cheek. Father grabbed her and ran to their old car. Mother got in and took Alana into her hands. Jacob got into the front passenger seat. Father started the engine and drove them to the hospital as fast as he could. As quickly as he was, it took over an hour for them to get to the hospital, given that their farm was 50 miles away from the city. Jacob's mother tried to wake Alana up the whole ride, but with no luck. Jacob was petrified. His little heart was filled with dread. As his parents stopped the car and ran to the hospital entrance, Jacob watched them, frozen, in the car seat. He felt like the whole world was getting dimmed. After the nurse took his sister to the trolley, the mother followed them. Father came back and took the vehicle to the parking lot. Then Father reassured him that his little sister was going to be okay. But the tears falling from his eyes could not reassure Jacob. Then they quickly went to the ICU, where Alana was taken. Mother was crying at the entrance. The doctor came out just as Jacob and Father, arrived there. He looked at them, and Jacob knew even before the doctor shook his head. They hugged each other and cried. Jacob felt like his whole world was falling apart. At the funeral, Jacob did not move from his sister's side. He prayed and prayed to God, asking him to heal her. "Dear God, please make her alive again." He promised to God that he would never quarrel with her again and that he would never make her cry ever. But God did not seem to believe him. It was unbearable to see the burial as he watched his little sister bury part of his heart that day. Time heals many wounds, but Jacob was constantly reminded of the emptiness in his heart where Alana resided whenever he saw other kids play, quarrel, or just talk with their siblings. One day, he learned that one of his friends at school, Tim, also had a little sister, Tina, who was just 3 years old. He was thrilled. He just wanted a sister. It didn't matter if she was not living with them. He figured that Tim's sister could be his sister as well. After that day, Jacob got closer to Tim as a friend. Tim also started to like Jacob as a friend once he learned that the silent boy was a good person. Tim's father was also a farmer, and Jacob's father knew him. Their farm was a few miles away from Jacob's farm. They knew well what Jacob's family had gone through and understood that it hit the little boy especially. They were happy that Jacob had made good friends with their son. Both families saw it as a start for Jacob to move on from his loss. Jacob always tried to visit Tim's house to spend time with Tim and Tina. Jacob loved her like his own sister. He would ride his bike to Tim's house on weekends. Tina also loved him back the same way she loved her brother. As time passed, Tina could fill the empty space in Jacob's heart left behind by Alana. Now Jacob and Tim were in middle school. One day Tim was asked to go to the office during a class. He was asked to bring his things as well. Jacob felt uneasy about it. Usually, it is not good news if they send you home in the middle of the day. When the teacher returned, she looked unfortunate, but she did not say anything. Jacob could not focus on the lessons for the rest of the day. When the school bell rang, he went to the teacher and asked her why Tim was sent home. The teacher knew Tim was his best friend. She told him he had received some bad news from home. She did not tell him what the bad news was. Jacob remembered that Tim's grandmother was quite old. Now he suspected that she might have passed away. He felt sad to think that because he liked Tim's grandmother. She was a kind woman. Just as Jacob turned to go to the school bus, he found his parents coming. His mother came and hugged him. Jacob asked her if Tim's grandmother had passed away. She looked at her husband sadly. Then she told him that Tina had been in an accident. She told him a drunk driver had crashed through the school fence at recess. Tina had been playing with some friends near the fence. 3 girls were hit, and Tina passed away from the injuries. "No, no, no, no!" Jacob screamed so loud with extreme sadness and anger. Then he ran away. He went to a corner of the playground and started crying hard. His father followed him and hugged him while he cried hard. The parents were devastated. They did not know how to console their son this time. They hoped that time would heal him again. At Tina's funeral, Jacob prayed again. However, he knew that Tina was not coming back. He even asked God to take years away from his life to give them to Tina. But he knew that was the last day he would see her. At the burial, all that happened was Alana came to him as a flashback, and he broke down crying. Many at the funeral knew of his past and that Tina was like a sister to him. Everyone shed tears that day. They could feel the grief of Tina's family, but it was the grief that Jacob went through that hit them the most. Jacob fell into depression. With great effort and support from counselors, he came out of depression. It took several months for him to recover fully, but he was not even close to the same Jacob who was before Tina's passing away. He became more distant from everyone, including Sam. He tried to talk with Sam several times after Tina passed away, but Sam did not encourage him, and it seemed he was avoiding Jacob. Finally, Jacob understood that Sam reminded him too much of Tina. It was his way of coping, and Jacob was okay with it. It seemed that Tina was the only thing holding the two friends together. Now that she was gone, their friendship was not sustainable. However, Jacob went through middle and high school, showing great promise. Like many of his schoolmates, he wasn't even interested in having a girlfriend. While other guys were interested in getting a girlfriend, he completely ignored all kinds of relationships and focused entirely on his education. He was doing very well in exams. He was always the best in the class. Maybe it was a way of coping with the mental pain. However, his parents were happy that he was doing well. Jacob decided that he wanted to become a doctor. He just wanted to save lives and stop the heartache. He would be able to help other people by not letting them experience losing a loved one. Jacob became a doctor after years of extensive training and countless written and practical tests. He completed his residency successfully. Everyone thought he was a little numb to the pain and suffering you see at the hospital. Maybe he was, but most probably it was because he had learned to cope with his feelings better from what he had gone through while he was a kid. Soon he was hired by one of the best hospitals in the country. He assisted the chief surgeon for several months before being put on duty alone as the primary surgeon. The first day he was in charge of theater as a qualified surgeon in the city hospital, he was a little nervous. It was Christmas, and most doctors were on leave. So he was the one with life and death in his hand. Just as he put on his coat, a girl was brought into the ER with multiple injuries after she was hit by a car. Jacob took the case and he examined her. Her heart rate was meager. No one thought she could be saved after seeing the severity of her injuries, but the only thing he saw when he looked at her was that she looked exactly like Tina. He closed his eyes briefly and then looked at her face again. She was still precisely like Tina. "Is there anything wrong, doctor?" a nurse asked since he was frozen for a few seconds. "No, everything's fine. Let's save her. We will save her," he said, determined to save her. The nurse was surprised because no doctor usually talked with that much certainty. It was because they did not want to jinx it before they did it. Jacob did several surgeries on her, which took over 8 hours to complete. It was exhausting. Sometimes he almost gave up, but looking at her face gave him the courage to continue. At the end of it, the little girl was stable and on her path to recovery. No one thought it was possible. All the nurses were happy and surprised at how good their new doctor was. They all congratulated him on the success of the surgery. After checking all her vitals, he went to get some rest. In a few hours, he came to ICU to check on her, and he was surprised to see Tim and his wife. As soon as Tim saw him, he hugged Jacob and told him they were forever grateful to him for saving their daughter. Then Jacob told him the most fantastic thing. "Tim, I saw in your daughter our little sister, Tina. She and also my sister, Atlanta, were the ones who kept me going through that surgery. when even I doubted myself sometimes." Jacob's words moved Tim. He said, "I am so sorry for pushing you away after Tina passed away. Jacob, it's just that you reminded me of her too much. I should have been with you, though. I know it must have hurt you the same way as it did to me when Tina passed away, maybe even more. Because I know that you got your sister back through Tina. I can't even imagine what it was like to lose her twice. I am sorry, Jacob." Tim had tears running down his face. Jacob put his hands on Tim's shoulders. "Don't even think of it, Jacob. I understood why you were like that at that time. I could understand your pain. That's why I did not bother you much after that. But I am forever grateful to your family for letting me into your lives and giving me the chance to have a sister again. That was beyond anything I could dream of. In a way, God answered my prayers to give Alana back by sending me to Tina and your family. And today, God has given me a chance to save Tina as well. I am grateful for that. Now both Alana and Tina live in my heart forever."
"Son, I have to tell you something," Agnes said to Ethan. "Mom, I love to hear the details, but I need to go and meet Irene right now," Ethan said, getting up to leave. "It's been ages. I miss her." "That's exactly what I need to talk to you about," Agnes said. Ethan's expressions suddenly changed. The smile of excitement he had a few seconds ago wholly vanished. "What do you mean? Did something happen to her?" "Please sit down," Agnes insisted, knowing her son needed to be seated for this news. Ethan didn't argue and did as he was told. "What happened, Ma? Please say something," Ethan urged. He saw the concern on his mother's face and knew something was wrong. "Irene left you for another man," she exclaimed after trying so hard to say it more nicely but failed. "What do you mean?" Ethan's mind could not comprehend what his mother had said. He had already suffered too much for his age. He wasn't ready for a blow like this. "Sweetie, she is dating Mr. Smith's son, the heir to the oil company. She even sent her engagement ring back. I put it up in your room," Agnes explained, trying to hold back her tears after seeing her son's reaction. She knew very well how much he loved her. This news was bound to break his heart, so she waited for him to return so that she could tell it to him in person. Ethan, who was in the military, had been serving in Afghanistan and had just returned after a year. While there, the thought of only two people kept him going through the difficult time: his mother, Agnes, and his beautiful fiancée, Irene. Coming from a low-income family where his mother was a widow from a very young age, Ethan decided to join the Army and help his mother financially. He wanted to earn something so that he could return, marry the love of his life, and settle down, taking care of his mother. To his despair, things did not go as he had planned. He couldn't believe it. He had never been wrong about anyone. How could he not see that Irene wasn't loyal? He remembered seeing nothing but love in her eyes. This news shocked the young man so much that it began to affect his mental health. He would have sudden outbursts of anger, punch walls, and argue with random people. As a result, he was barred from returning to the military. He had lost everything except his mother, of course. Agnes had worked hard all her life, working 2 shifts to make ends meet. She wanted the best for her son and finally felt content when he got a stable job in the Army. But that happiness did not last. Instead, at such an old age, she was compelled to begin working again. She started working at a local factory, stitching clothes all day long. Sitting in that position caused her severe back pain, which did not go unnoticed by her son. Ethan decided that it was time to pull himself together. He couldn't keep punishing the only good person he had in life for his own mistakes and wrong choices. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything I have put you through, but I promise this is the end of your misery," he said one day. He had his head in her lap as she combed her fingers through his hair. "What do you mean, honey? The military isn't an option now," she stated. "I know. I found another job. It doesn't pay that well, but it will be enough to pay your medical bills and get you to quit your job." He looked up at her and smiled. She only had one son, no other child or husband, but she knew this one son would be enough for her. A tear rolled down her cheek, which she wiped right away. "Where did you get the job?" she asked. "At Luck Oil as a truck driver," he said, knowing how his mother would react. "Wait, what? That oil company? The same one owned by Mr. Smith?" she asked, her voice getting louder with every word. Ethan nodded. "The same Mr. Smith whose son that bitch Irene ran off with?" "Ma, please don't say that about her." "What do you mean? First, she leaves you for another man. Then she is the reason you lose your job in the military. And now she will have you work under her new boyfriend." Agnes was yelling now. Just the idea of her son working for that man filled her with rage. "I can keep working until you find a better job." It took that entire evening for Ethan to convince his mother finally, but fortunately, he was able to do so. Living in a small town, finding a job was not easy, especially if you had a record of anger management issues. The following week, Ethan began his job at Luck Oil as a truck driver. He would spend days out on the road transporting their oil, getting only a few hours of sleep every day. Every time he felt exhausted, he would close his eyes and remember his mother, which was more than enough to get him going again. Although Ethan was gradually getting used to the work schedule, there was something about the behavior of Mr. Smith that didn't feel right. Any chance that the man would get to humiliate Ethan, he wouldn't miss it. It was as if he was looking for excuses to shout at him, not just at his own small mistakes, but even when some other driver did something wrong, Ethan would be blamed. At first, it felt as if it was just a coincidence, but eventually it became apparent that it was entirely intentional. Of course, Ethan didn't share this with his mother. She would have become defensive and forced him to quit. That was not an option for him. He needed this job. He needed to take care of his mother, and now he had no other opportunity. The discrimination continued, and daily it became harder for him to control his anger in that situation. It was as if they were trying their best to incite him, just so that he would have an outburst of rage. Ethan was smart enough not to fall for it until one day they crossed all boundaries. During the company audit, it came to light that somebody was stealing oil from the trucks. As expected, Mr. Smith came to Ethan and started accusing him of the theft. He could take anything, any accusation, but Ethan was not a thief. This is the one accusation he couldn't stand. He could feel his heartbeat racing with anger as his legs began shaking. "Listen, sir, everybody here knows what you've been doing with me this past month, but if there's one thing I'm not putting up with, it's being called a thief," Ethan said sternly. "So are you calling me a liar, saying that I've been targeting you unfairly?" Mr. Smith retorted. "I'm just saying I'm not the person who stole the oil. Find the real person who did," Ethan said, turning around to leave since he had had enough. "What else can you expect from the son of a whore who'd sleep with any man just to get a loaf of bread?" Mr. Smith snickered. It was as if all the anger Ethan had been storing for the past month was ready to flow out. How could someone say this about the woman who had done everything for him on her own? His jaws tightened, his fists clenched. It was as if he no longer had any control over his body. He was a different person now, a person who would do anything to protect his mother. He turned around, running towards his boss and knocking him onto the floor. He sat on his chest and began to punch him in the face. It took a while for the other drivers around him to understand what had just happened. They ran towards them, pulling Ethan off of Mr. Smith. Ethan couldn't help but notice Mr. Smith's expression when he was being dragged away. Despite being beaten up and having a bleeding nose, the older man was smiling. It was a smile of success, as if this was what he had wanted all along. That evening, Ethan returned home, and even before he could tell his mother about what had happened that day, the police came storming in and took him away. Agnes was left crying, wondering what her son had done to cause this. Only a day later, a friend from work came to visit her and told her about what had happened. Ethan was charged with assault and theft. Since the Smiths were wealthy and influential, they hired the best lawyers to fight this case against him. It didn't come as a surprise when Ethan was convicted of both crimes, beginning his time in prison. Prison life wasn't as tough as Ethan had expected it to be. There were only two things that bothered him there. The first was that he had become a victim of the plans the Smith had against him. Was it Irene who made them do this? He would often think to himself, why would she? He didn't even go after her, letting her live the life she wanted to. The second thing that bothered him even more was that his mother was all alone at this age, even though she did not deserve any of it. Days turned into months, and the same thoughts plagued Ethan's mind. One day, Eric, like the prison leader, came up to talk to him. Everybody in prison was afraid of Eric. That is the level of influence he had inside and outside the prison. He came from a wealthy family and was inside on some charges of drug abuse. When Eric came close to Ethan, the latter was worried if he had done something to upset him. But in reality, Eric would prove to be his savior. As it turned out, years ago, before Ethan had even joined the army, he had helped save the lives of Eric and his entire family. Their car had gotten into an accident, leading to a fire. Everybody around them moved away, scared that the car would explode. The firefighters were still a few minutes away, and the entire family could lose their life at that time. It was at that moment that Ethan decided to step up. He rushed towards the car and pulled each family member out, one by one, bringing them to safety. He had no idea then that this act of courage would come back and reward him like this someday. He wanted to help Ethan out, so he used his influence to hire a private detective and the best lawyers to find the truth and free Ethan of his guilty charge. Soon, Ethan got to know the entire truth, which completely blew his mind away. This whole time, Irene hadn't left him. She had been abducted by Mr. Smith's spoiled son and was kept in that house against her will. They got the police to conduct a raid, finding her in that house. The Smiths were convicted of several crimes while Ethan was free on parole. After more than a year, he met Irene, who was still madly in love with him. He knew he couldn't be wrong about her. The two of them eventually married and began their life together, giving Agnes the life of ease she always deserved.